them yes, some of them no. But the states have approved medical cannabis for these conditions. So you've got cancer in there, arthritis, severe psoriasis, muscular dystrophy, Tourette's syndrome, traumatic brain injury, so all kinds of different conditions. Everything from things we think of as more physical conditions to things that we think of as more mental conditions. And then in addition, most states have a clause that a medical provider can also determine that other conditions, if they're severe and debilitating, can also qualify you for medical cannabis. There's some key components of cannabis. This is hypothesized again. This is not proven. THC is thought to make you high. CBD is thought to have the medical benefits, reduces pain, seizures, doesn't make you high. THC and CBD have opposite effects in the endocannabinoid system, so there may be actually some countervailing effect. That THC has one effect, CBD could counterbalance that. CBN is thought to cause drowsiness. THC breaks down into CBN over time with exposure to light. So even if that label on the plant that was bought 6 months ago says a certain amount of THC, it actually may have fallen over time. In addition, there are a lot of other compounds, terpenes, many terpenes are identified. They're not specific to cannabis. They interact in ways we don't understand. And in addition, different terpenes, THC, CBD, CBN, these all become activated at different temperatures. And so you could actually have a high THC plant. If someone's vaping it at a low temperature, they may not be releasing any THC at all. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. And in addition, this is all hypothesized. We actually have research that shows that THC has major therapeutic effects, despite conventional wisdom to the contrary. And in fact, we find that in some of our studies, CBD actually decreases symptom relief, which contradicts what we see. Typically, it seems that THC from our research intensifies the effect, both the symptom relief and the side effects, whereas CBD kind of moderates both of those. So, research, why don't we know more about all these conditions states are approving? Well, it's very hard to do randomized control trials. These are generally the gold standard in medicine. You compare one chemical compound to another or a placebo. Cannabis can't be reduced to just one chemical compound, as we saw in the prior slide. And also, you can only buy cannabis for research from the University of Mississippi. All other cannabis used for research would be a federal offense. Supposedly, the feds are going to open this up to other universities, other locations. They've been saying that for years. I've not seen any evidence of any other locations being approved. I would like to show you, point you to this picture here that I got from online. This is a picture of government cannabis that was sent to someone doing a study on vets with PTSD. And that's what it looked like. And this is what commercial grade medical marijuana looks like, or it may look even better than that nowadays. But this actually had mold on it too, so it was really good for research. There's also an extremely long approval process. That's why there's only one major study I know of where they actually got the cannabis from the government and used it to look at PTSD. And the long approval process, you have to go through NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, not terribly supported generally for therapeutic investigations. DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, again, not so much looking at therapeutic, more looking at the substance abuse side. And then the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, you have to get it approved as an investigational new drug, so you have to be able to standardize it in some way to get it approved. It took 6 years to get the PTSD study associated with this cannabis approved. And THC and CBD potencies are significantly below what's sold, which you probably have guessed from comparing these two pictures right here. So it's not going to give you very good insights about what happens in the real world if people are using cannabis that's 32% THC. Well, the government, you can only get up to 6% THC last time I checked. They may have increased that by now. I know they've been trying to make it match better what's in the market, to get some higher CBD strains in particular, but I don't know how successful they've been with that. So where does this leave us, since we can't do the randomized control trials really? We have observational data. So we see state level comparisons of aggregate effects between states that have legal versus illegal markets. We see patient level comparisons of people who chose to join cannabis programs or who have chosen to consume cannabis compared with comparison groups. That's not random. Patients choose to smoke the cannabis in these studies and acquire it. So they're not getting assigned randomly, you smoke it, you don't. Cannabis is difficult to standardize, so methods of ingestion, plant variation. And interestingly enough, economists are uniquely positioned to establish causal relationships in this observational environment. The whole field of econometrics is really about using observational data to establish causal relationships. We don't do so many of these randomized control trials. And so you actually have quite a few economists who've been contributing to the literature on the effects of cannabis. Regulatory regimes are also obviously going to affect markets. They're in ways beyond just what cannabis does, so constraints, efficiency, overall welfare. If we see less benefits in Minnesota, is that because they only have non-smokable cannabis? And all these sort of things we need to take into account. Very few current studies on the different regulatory regimes, although there's some recent ones that suggest that places that have dispensaries actually have better functioning markets. And again, data is hard to find. So what do we know? So if I had to summarize what we know on the medical side, so we definitely have seen plenty of studies that show it substitutes with conventional medications. So looking at prescription medications, Bradford and Bradford have a couple of papers looking at Medicare and Medicaid data, looking at the medications people had from those insurance plans, and they found dramatic reductions. I'll show you in the next slide. We have a paper that looks at scheduled drugs specifically. We find declines across a whole bunch of different variables. I'll show you another slide of that as well. We found it also declines in opioids and even cessation of opioid use among people enrolling in the medical cannabis program here in New Mexico. And it's been shown actually to substitute over-the-counter drugs as well. We have a recent study looking at sleep aids. And we have another study that shows it's effectively used to treat a very large range of conditions. I'll show you that graph in a moment as well. There also have been some studies, these are coming from economists here, looking at these aggregate state level effects. So Anderson, Hansen, and Reese look at traffic fatalities, and they find there's a reduction in traffic fatalities, and it's driven entirely by traffic fatalities where the blood alcohol content is greater than 0. So there's less alcohol-related traffic fatalities. Tobacco, there's another paper from tobacco, reductions in tobacco use, and then there's a recent paper from 2018 on illegal opioid use. They found a reduction in illegal opioid use. Most of these other studies have focused more on actual prescription opioid use, but there's also reductions in the illegal use. So just to sort of back up some of the things I was just saying, this is from one of those Bradford papers. They took all the drugs in their database and they categorized them by what condition they were trying to treat, and then they calculated the number of daily doses prescribed per physician in those states, and they found without a medical marijuana law, compared with a medical marijuana law, in all cases there were price reductions except for glaucoma. Glaucoma was the only one. It's fairly small relative to the other ones. That one was not lower in the medical cannabis states. But in all these other, anxiety, depression, nausea, pain, psychosis, seizures, sleep disorders, spasticity, we see reductions in pharmaceutical expenditures for Medicare and Medicaid patients. This is from our paper on Schedule 2 through 4 prescriptions. We have a comparison group in gray. We have the black is the people who joined the medical cannabis program. Both groups of patients were offered the opportunity to join the medical cannabis program. Those who did, we joined in month 7, so we pulled their prescription records from 6 months prior for both groups, and then followed them for a year and a half afterwards. And what we can see is there tends to be very little difference across the two groups beforehand, and then they diverge afterwards. Whether you measure it in terms of the number of prescriptions, the number of prescription drug classes, so that would be things like narcotics, sedatives, different categories, and then dates. The dates is the number of times you fill prescriptions, and then the providers is the number of providers filling prescriptions. So in all cases, all measures they look at. This is looking at opioid use. Here the medical cannabis enrollment is at time, your first month here. We have a comparison group. We see the medical cannabis group. They decline, and actually a surprising percentage of them cease using opioids altogether. Now it is worth mentioning, these look different. So it may be that the people enrolled in the medical cannabis program are actually people who had more problematic opioid use to start with. That might be part of the reason why it was easier for them to reduce. But we can't tell that because we could not randomly select people and put them into one group versus the other. That's the problem with the lack of random selection. Is we don't know if there are people who are selecting into these groups, if those characteristics are driving the results, or if we can rely on just comparing across and see this reduction and see that it's driven by enrollment. So this just to highlight the whole opioid epidemic in case no one's seen this graph before. So we have car accidents, we have guns, and then the reason why everybody's so focused on the opioid epidemic is precisely this line here. This is going from 2000 to 2014. You see just dramatic increase. So if cannabis is something that does substitute for opioids, this is something we really need to be looking at. And indeed, quite a few people are. This is a graph of all the different conditions we found symptom relief for in our data. So the red line is your starting symptom level. The blue line is your ending symptom level. These are actually the point estimates for the symptom reduction, so they're going to be negative numbers with confidence intervals. And first of all, we see on average people reduce by about 3 point something symptom relief on a scale of 0 to 10. So pretty dramatic improvement in symptom levels. We also see that across the board, there's not that much difference across the symptoms. So everybody, regardless of their condition, whether it's anxiety, excessive appetite, insomnia, all sorts of pain conditions, seems to be getting similar levels of symptom relief, which is sort of interesting. So it seems to be quite effective across a wide range of conditions. Now this is looking at some of those economist studies, looking at the state level analysis. So these are traffic fatality rates. They compare the no medical marijuana law states with the X's, and then the medical marijuana states with the diamonds here, and you can see here's legalization. We see this significant drop here in terms of traffic fatalities. And again, the effects were entirely driven by traffic fatalities with blood alcohol greater than 0. So the ones there was no change in traffic fatalities with blood alcohol equal to 0. It was all in those over. So that's where we get the substitution with alcohol. And they faced an extremely difficult review process with this paper. Here's an estimate from Powell et al. This is looking at per capita opioid overdoses and legal medical dispensary access. Right here is where the 0 point for having dispensary access, and we can see that drop off in per capita opioid overdoses. And again, these are our confidence intervals. They lie completely below that 0 line, so that suggests they are statistically significantly lower. One interesting contribution from this paper, though, is that a medical marijuana law alone does not have this effect. You have to have the dispensaries, so people need to be able to get back access to all those products. So, to summarize briefly what we know about cannabis as medicine: pros, potential to treat many conditions, no risk of fatal overdose. It's literally the way it operates in your brain. You cannot have a fatal overdose from cannabis itself. Side effects are generally mild in our studies. There may be potential preventative effects we're increasingly seeing in the research. And it seems to be relatively lower risk than many conventional medications. Certainly opioids and benzos can kill you, cannabis doesn't. There are, however, some cons. It can be addictive and habit forming. Long-term effects, there's not very many studies out there. We have anecdotal evidence, but very little research. There are no rigorous studies that I know of on developing brains in humans, so prenatal or teenagers. There's lack of scientific studies on many conditions, so people are just kind of treating through trial and error. They don't have a doctor who's saying, take this dose for this and so forth, or this product. It's very difficult to standardize or find the identical product again. And then the major problem, it is illegal in many states still to use it. So that wraps up the medicine side.